was good, the little one was good, and the big one was bad.
This is how it started. David and his brothers were guarding sheep, and then all his older brothers went to go fight Goliath. And then he was guarding the sheep, and then later he brought his basket of some food to his brothers. And then I think he went to the king and asked, "Can I go?" And he gave him, I'm pretty sure, a sword and some armor, but it was too heavy, and he took it off.
And all the people were scared, except one, David. He had a sling and a rock.
And then he walked to the river, picked up some stones, he had a slingshot, and then he walked up to Goliath, and Goliath said, "What, I am a dog, or..." And then he did this because it was an old slingshot, and then he threw it on it.
The guy shooted rocks at Goliath.
And he put that in his forehead.
And it sinked it right in.
And then Goliath fell right to the ground.
Dead, and everybody in that army was with Goliath. They ran away. They were so scared.
He did that because God was with him.
David and Goliath. We know the story, don't we? Why don't we read it out of Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, The Message, just to remind ourselves of the story. The Philistines drew up their troops for battle. The Philistines were on one hill, the Israelites on the opposing hill, with the valley between them. A giant nearly 10 feet tall stepped out from the Philistine line into the open, Goliath from Gath. He had a bronze helmet on his head and was dressed in armor, 126 pounds of it. He wore bronze shin guards and carried a bronze sword. His spear was like a fence rail. The spear tip alone weighed over 15 pounds. His shield bearer walked ahead of him. Goliath stood there and called out to the Israelite troops, "Why bother using your whole army? Am I not Philistine enough for you? Pick your best fighter and pit him against me. If he gets the upper hand and kills me, the Philistines will all become your slaves. But if I get the upper hand and kill him, you'll all become our slaves and serve us. I challenge the troops of Israel this day. Give me a man. Let us fight it out together." When Saul and his troops heard the Philistines' challenge, they were terrified and lost all hope. Each morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath took his stand and made his speech. Enter David. He arrived at the camp just as the army was moving into battle formation, shouting the war cry. He ran to the troops who were deployed and greeted his brothers. While they were talking together, the Philistine champion, Goliath of Gath, stepped out from the front lines of the Philistines and gave his usual challenge. David heard him. The Israelites, to a man, fell back the moment they saw the giant, totally frightened. David asked, "What's in it for the man who kills that Philistine and gets rid of this ugly blot on Israel's honor? Who does he think he is anyway, this uncircumcised Philistine, taunting the armies of God alive?" The things David was saying were picked up and reported to Saul. Saul sent for him. David said, "Master, don't give up hope. I'm ready to go and fight this Philistine." Saul answered David, "You can't go and fight this Philistine. You're too young and inexperienced. He's been at this fighting business since before you were born." David said, "I've been a shepherd tending sheep for my father. Whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I'd go after it, knock it down and rescue the lamb. If it turned on me, I'd grab it by the throat, wring its neck and kill it. Lion or bear, it made no difference. I killed it. And I'll do the same to this Philistine pig who is taunting the troops of God alive." God who delivered me from the teeth of the lion and the claws of the bear will deliver me from this Philistine." Saul said, "Go, and God help you." Then Saul outfitted David as a soldier in armor. He put his bronze helmet on his head and belted his sword on him over the armor. David tried to walk, but he could hardly budge. David told Saul, "I can't even move with all this stuff on me. I'm not used to this." And he took it all off. Then David took his shepherd's staff, selected 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the pocket of his shepherd's pack, and with his sling in his hand, approached Goliath. As the Philistine paced back and forth, his shield bearer in front of him, he noticed David. He took one look down on him and sneered, "Am I a dog that you come after me with a stick? Come on, I'll make roadkill of you for the buzzards. I'll turn you into a tasty morsel for the field mice." David answered, "You come at me with sword and spear and battle axe. I come at you in the name of God of the angel armies, the God of Israel's troops, whom you curse and mock. This very day God is handing you over to me. I'm about to kill you, cut off your head and serve up your body and the bodies of your Philistine buddies to the crows and coyotes. The whole earth will know that there's an extraordinary God in Israel. And everyone gathered here will learn that God doesn't save by means of sword or spear. The battle belongs to God. He's handing you to us on a platter." That roused the Philistine, and he started toward David. David took off from the front line, running toward the Philistine. David reached into his pocket for a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine hard in the forehead, embedding the stone deeply. The Philistine crashed face down in the dirt. And that's how David beat the Philistine, with a sling and a stone. He hit him and killed him. No sword for David. Well, the story is pretty well known. Maybe not the backstory as much. What happened before this event with David and Goliath? And really, it starts with the first king of Israel, King Saul. And Saul was, like I say, the first one appointed by the prophet Samuel to be a king over Israel. And he was, in many respects, a great leader, and yet he had a fatal flaw. It was his pride. And because of his pride, Saul repeatedly took matters into his own hands and did things that God had told him expressly not to do. The capstone event happened when, through the prophet Samuel, Saul was told to go to battle against the Amalekites. And when that battle was done, Saul was to keep no spoils from the war. None of the flocks, none of the riches, nothing was to be kept. Saul and his troops went to war. They did what they'd been told to do. They won the battle. But when it came time to get rid of all the spoils of war, they decided to hang on to the best of the best. They kept that for themselves. And God sent the prophet Samuel to confront Saul. And when Samuel shows up, he said, "Saul, did you do what God commanded you to do?" And Saul says, "Oh yeah, we did it. We went, we fought, we won, we destroyed all this stuff just like you said." And Samuel goes, "Well, if you destroyed everything, why do I hear sheep bleating out behind the tent here? It sounds like you kept some stuff." And Saul, being quick on his feet, says, "Oh, well, yeah, that was, the people really wanted to keep some of the really good stuff. And so I went along with that, but we're going to do something really good with it. We are going to offer this as a sacrifice to God. So I know it's not exactly what you said, but we've got an even better idea." Here's what Samuel said to Saul. "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." The next thing that happens is that God tells Samuel, "I want you to go and anoint a new king." Saul doesn't know it. This is going on behind the scenes. As far as Saul can figure out, he still is in control. But But God has decreed that the kingdom is going to be taken from Saul, and he sends Samuel to go and anoint a new king. 1 Samuel 16:1, he says, "Fill your horn with oil." That's what they would use to anoint the new king. He says, I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for whom I have provided myself a king among his sons. And so Samuel does that. He goes, he finds this guy, Jesse, and he says, the Lord has asked me to come, and I need to see your sons. Could you bring your sons out so I can meet them? So Jesse, being a proud father, he brings out his eldest son, the pride and joy of his life, and he stands before Samuel, and Samuel immediately thinks, this is the guy. You know, tall, dark, and handsome, presents well, speaks well. I can see why God sent me here for this guy. And the Lord says to Samuel, he's not the one. So Samuel says, do you have another son? Jesse says, well, yeah, I have another son. So he brings son number 2 and goes, oh, yeah, this guy, class act. Obviously, this is the one. The Lord says, he's not the one either. In fact, in the course of this, here's this verse from 1 Samuel 16:7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Well, Jesse keeps bringing sons one after another, and every time the word back that Samuel gets from God is, this isn't the one. And finally, they've gone through 7 sons. And Samuel says, is that it? Are there any more? And Jesse says, well, there remains yet the youngest, but he's out keeping the sheep. But of course, we come to find out that that young sheep farmer is none other than David. A guy that apparently was young enough, nondescript enough, that when Dad was thinking of people to introduce to the great prophet, didn't even think about bringing David in from the field to have the meeting. And yet it was in David that God saw something in his heart. They said, this is a good man. This is a man that will become a great leader. He is the one that I want you to anoint as Israel's next king. I don't think David fully understood what he was being anointed for. This whole thing is a little odd to him. Here's this prophet, and he's pouring oil on his head, and he's like, well, what's this all about? But meanwhile, there's trouble brewing in the kingdom because Saul, while God's Spirit his blessing has been taken away from him, Saul has become a very tormented individual. 1 Samuel 16:14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul would fall into these dark moods, these rages, and it seemed that the only thing that would soothe him was music. And so Saul's court began looking for a gifted musician who could come in and provide music therapy for the king. And who do you suppose turns out to be a really gifted musician? He'd been out there on the hills watching sheep for a lot of years with a lot of downtime on his hands. And he'd been practicing his music, and it turns out that David, who is going to be the next king of Israel, is a gifted musician who's brought in to bring comfort to the very tormented current king. In fact, it says that David actually became appointed as Saul's armor bearer, a very honorable position. It showed great trust that was placed in him. And so that forms the backstory to the David and Goliath story. When David shows up and he says, well, I'm willing to take the challenge. I'll go fight this giant. And word gets back to Saul. David is not a complete unknown to Saul. Saul has heard him sing. He has entrusted him with this honor of being his armor bearer. And he knows something about David's character. And there's something about this young man that is improbable as it seems. Even Saul says, maybe he is the one to go and fight for us. Well, we've been doing some famous 40s, right? We're celebrating 40 years for Dungeness Community Church, and we've been doing this series on famous 40s of the Bible. Did you spot the 40 in this passage? There it is. Each morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath took his stand and made his speech. For 40 days, Goliath came out to mock God, to threaten God's people. And the battle was a stalemate because there was nobody in the line of Israel that was willing to walk into what looked like certain death and fight this giant. And yet, while the crowd was taking comfort in just being part of the crowd and not stepping forward, one guy does step forward. David says, "What right does he have to mock the God of Israel? I'll go and face him." You know, as I think about this story, there are 4 P's and 3 lessons I want to pull out of it. The first one is the danger of pride. Pride lies embedded all through this story. It is the reason that Saul was going to have the kingdom taken away from him was because of his pride. He figured his way was better than God's way. And God says, "You know what, Saul, I would far rather that you just learn to obey me than that you came up with some grand idea of what you're going to do for me that isn't my will." It certainly was the problem of Goliath. Goliath's pride literally cost him his head as he came out and swore that he was not afraid of the God of Israel. Proverbs 16:18 says it like this: "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." In Goliath's case, literally before a fall. It can go before all of us, can't it? Pride is kind of one of those things that just seems to come with the operating system for most people. We just kind of internally think that we're probably a little more special than other folks. And that maybe our way really is better. And we know what God says, we know what he wants, and yet push comes to shove, we're kind of like Saul, and we go, "Well, I got a better idea. You know, God, I know that's like a good plan, but my plan I think is even better." And pride rears its head. Or we just push God aside completely. Say, "I don't need you. I can do this on my own," but pride becomes a trap. David's story certainly points out that pride leads to downfall. The second are 2 P's, and that is ping pong. This, I realize, probably was the first thing you thought of as you read the story of David and Goliath was ping pong. For those of you that maybe didn't pick up on that, let me just give you some context. I mentioned a week or so ago that Burnett and I had a chance to go up and hear Dr. Bruce Walke lecture this last summer. And he got telling a story about David and Goliath. And when his daughter was little, they would act out Bible stories. And David and Goliath was one of her favorite stories to act out. And so, of course, Daddy had to be Goliath because he was, the big guy. And she got to be David. And they would get in the living room, and she had her little dish towel slingshot there. You had to go like this because it was an old slingshot. And so as the battle would commence, she would have to say, "I trust in God." And then she would throw a ping pong ball out of her dish towel at the giant, and the giant would come crashing to the floor, right? Well, he said that one day, as they were getting ready to play the game, she was so excited about the slingshot that she forgot to say her line, "I trust in God," and she just threw the ping pong ball. And Dr. Walke just stood there. And she said, "Daddy, you're supposed to fall down." And he said, "You didn't say I trust in the Lord. Let's try it again." So this time they started over again, and he made his challenge, and the little girl bravely stood up, and she said, "I trust in the Lord." And the giant still didn't fall down. She said, "Daddy, I said it, you still didn't fall down." He said, "You didn't throw the ping pong ball." The moral of the story is, you got to trust God and throw the ping pong ball. God doesn't call us to be passive participants in what he wants to do. David's victory was assured because God was on his side, and yet God did not ask David to simply sit off to the side and watch lightning strike Goliath. God wanted David to engage in the fight and do something. Get out there and throw the stone. But David, is not just up to you because it is God that goes with you to make sure that stone finds its mark, that victory comes. You've got to trust God, and you've got to throw the ping pong balls. It also struck me as I was reading the story this past week that David took along with him 5 stones. You know what that says to me? It says that David was aware that while God was going to give him the victory and he had his trust in God, he also knew that as a mere shepherd boy, he didn't always get him on the first shot. And he was ready in case there was a miss. Now, I figure he just took 5 because he anticipated he wouldn't get off more than 5 shots before it was going to be all over, right? But he was ready in case there was a miss. But you know, there are times in life that I said, Lord, I trust you. And I'm going to do something that frankly is kind of scary to me. I don't know if I'm able to do this. I don't know if I'm up to the task here, but Lord, I believe you're with me and I'm going to do it. And I go out there and I try, and my first try, I fail. Doesn't go well. And sometimes all I've taken is 1 stone with me. I go, well, that's it. That didn't work. I'm done. I'm going home. I tried. God, I said I trust you, and I missed. You know, I just challenge you, take along some extra stones. The fact you missed, the fact you failed doesn't mean that God isn't with you. It doesn't mean that he doesn't want you to be engaged. It just means that he may want you to grow through the failure. You know, you tried teaching a kid's Sunday school class once and the lesson didn't go good. That's okay. That doesn't mean you need to quit. It means you need to pull another stone out and get back in the fight. Maybe learn to fight it a different way. Trust God and throw the ping pong balls. The final P I want to put up there is a word that maybe you've heard, pedagogy. What is pedagogy? All the teachers, I think, here know it. Pedagogy is the function or the work of a teacher. You know, as I think about this story, it strikes me that David had skills. If David were a student in school today, we would say he was involved in a lot of extracurricular activities based on the things he could do. He obviously had been on the wrestling team. He had taken on the Lions and the Bears. He was in band. He practiced his instrument. He was probably first chair. He was known for his musical excellence. He was probably part of 4-H. He knew how to take care of sheep and did a good job. But he didn't just have skills, he also had character. We find that David has this profound sense of responsibility. I mean, I'm sorry, if I see a bear grab a lamb, I'm just going to say, well, he's going to have a nice lamb lunch. I'm not going to go chase him down. But David said, no, that's my flock. Nobody touches my flock. I'm going after the bear. Profound sense of responsibility. And along with that, he knew about courage. He knew what it was to be afraid and yet not allow his fear to dictate his actions. And he had a great love for God and for God's people. The thought that that giant was standing there insulting his God and insulting and challenging his people, David couldn't stomach that. You know what it tells me? Not just that David had a great heart, that he was a great man, but it also tells me that David had teachers involved in his life. Young men and women don't become great men and women in a vacuum. It's true that sometimes people become great because they've had to overcome immense adversity, and yet every great man or woman that I've known, if you talk to them a bit, they would tell you about key people who had influenced their lives over the years, who made a difference and built into them. Somebody had showed David how to play the harp. Somebody had showed David how to take care of lambs and had instilled in him a sense of ownership and duty and responsibility. Somebody had taught David to face opposition, to not allow danger to be what dictated his actions, to have courage. Somebody had taught David about God. Somebody had taught David that God was great and worthy to be served, worthy even to risk your life for him. Someone had taught David that. You know, even though David had been taught, none of his teachers seemed to recognize either his caliber or his calling. Even when Samuel the prophet shows up, his own father doesn't think to call David in because he just didn't think that this kid would be the kid. Sundays, we put the dismissal sign up for our children. And I love watching all the little kids scurrying across the front of the room, heading off to their Sunday school classes. But do you ever ask yourself, as you watch those little kids running by, what kind of greatness may be going by you? What has God called some of those young men, some of those young women, those children? What is his call on their life? What are they going to do in the world? What giants are they going to face? Maybe giants that none of us know how to overcome. But God is gifting them and preparing them, and he's going to call them to do great things. And yet here they are, just kind of running around in our auditorium, and sometimes we don't even notice them. You recognize any of these people? How about this young man? Turns out when he grew up, he kind of made a difference. Or how about this guy? We love this guy. We like to watch this guy a lot because once he grew up, it turns out he's pretty good with the football. Or how about the guy there at the bottom of the picture, that little boy? He's actually spoken to a lot of people all around the world and told them about Jesus. Or ladies, the little girl there in the corner, you might know her. In fact, I think you're using some of her material right now. That's Beth Moore. You know, David reminds us that God's next great leader may not be the person that we expect. It may be somebody that we look right over. It may be a child that he's given us an opportunity for a brief period of time to have an influence in their life, to encourage them, to teach them, to support their family. I've asked some people to come up, and so Bob and Wayne and Piper, why don't you come on up here? The last few weeks, I've been having different people join me as part of the message, because as we think about what has made Dungeness Community Church succeed as a church for the last 40 years, I want you to get the point that what makes us successful is not that we have superstar leaders. What makes us successful is that we have a body of people who have poured into each other's lives, who have used their gifts, who've taken steps of faith, and have made a difference. Now, Wayne Yamamoto was our youth pastor for how many years? 19 years, youth pastor, now our associate pastor. Wayne, when you were a kid, do you think the people that knew you said, now there goes a pastor?
No way. Not a chance. When I go back to my reunions, I see all my friends from high school, they just shake their head saying, you do what? And the same with my college friends. Of course, I did too many wrong things with them, but they just look at me, and actually there's about 4 of them that have become Christians now, so they're more accepting of the fact that I'm a pastor.
So why did you decide to give so much of your career, your life, to working with kids?
That's a good question. I actually got my start one summer in 1979. I volunteered for a junior high camp up at Redfish Lake. And I had no idea what I was getting into. And there were all these wild junior high kids, and they just kind of glommed onto me. And before I knew it, I was volunteering, and I ended up quitting my job with the Forest Service and going into ministry full time. So it's just kind of one of those things that just happened.
And this is one of the guys that happened in your ministry. This is a fairly young David Piper. I'm not done with you yet, Wayne. Did you spot Piper right away as being like really great pastoral material?
David showed up, I think, in the late 90s. He was a 6th grade kid. Whenever somebody would show up early or by themselves, that was always special, because that meant, oh, this he's willing to venture out. And so he showed up at an activity. We got his name, and then about 3 minutes later, we forgot his name. He was cooking corn. I asked him to cook corn at this barbecue. So we started calling him Corn Man because we couldn't remember his name, and this stuck. And I would have never guessed, but you never know what's going to happen. And here David is.
So, Piper, nobody thought that you would be a pastor. What happened? Why did you decide to do this?
I'm probably in the same boat Wayne is. I don't think anyone expected me to be a youth pastor. You know, it probably would have depended on who was approaching me or thinking about, because on Sunday I would act like the great church kid. I grew up in church, knew all the answers. Monday through Saturday I could party it up with the rest of them. So I think it really would have surprised people, depending on who knew me.
So something changed in there. God got hold of your heart.
Yes.
Turned you around. Why did you decide to come back to Sequim? Because you've been all over the world.
Yes.
Why are you here working with youth?
Yeah, so that's a great question. After I was in Guatemala, God transformed my heart. I left some of those things I need to leave behind. And I got back to Sequim, and I was like, all right, God, what's next? I was so excited. I was so on fire for Jesus that I was like, you know what? I was just teaching English in China. I'll go teach English in Afghanistan. And I'll do that for Jesus this time, And I was so excited, and I came home, and Wayne's like, hey, you should come hang out with the middle school students and maybe be the intern for the summer. And I was like, no, I'm going to Afghanistan because I want to serve Jesus. And so there was this real change in my heart. God spoke to me through that. I stayed for those 2 years, ended up going to Bible college after that. Some of the best times of my life, and now I'm here. I took Wayne's job. So
that's awesome. So Bob Torres, Bob and I go way back, and you came to Christ. How old were you when you became a Christian?
17.
17. And it's kind of interesting because before coming to Christ, you had been a what?
I was a Mormon. I was raised as a Mormon, single family home. Mom didn't really know quite how to handle us. So the Mormon Church has a great mentorship program. I had guys that took me and my little brother to football games and took us to different things. And then as we got older, they had a program where Mormon families meet together once a week. And they would take the older ones of us in high school, and we would go with them and kind of learn how to mentor people and disciple people. And so I learned that as a young kid, you're supposed to follow, you're supposed to do things, you're supposed to grow. Well, then in October of 1977, I gave my life to Jesus, got saved. And this is the youth group I joined. I got saved on either Friday or Saturday, I don't remember now, but that Sunday I was in that youth group. And, here I was, kid from a single family home, not a lot of money, not real great in school, just kind of an average kid. But if you see the two adults standing in the back there, they were our youth pastors, Barb and Ole Olander, and they poured into all those kids. I mean, that group of kids turned out really well, and they saw something. I mean, I think I had a heart for God even at a young age. Well, here, that was 77. In 2017, 40 years later, now I'm working with these high school kids and with Piper, and there we are in San Francisco working with the youth group. So yeah, those guys poured into my life, and here we are 40 years later.
That's great. Thank you, guys. So I'd like to challenge you to do something specific and practical about this. One, say hi to a kid. Don't let them go by and ignore them. They are real people, and God has plans and a future for them, and He's given you a chance to rub shoulders with them for a little bit. You don't know who the next David is, so don't miss that opportunity. Think about that God may be calling you in some way to be involved with youth. Maybe it's to be a Sunday school teacher. Maybe it's to come down and help with youth group. Maybe it's going to be baking cookies for Piper when he needs them for retreats or things. There are ways that you can help to support and have a role in the lives of these kids. And one of the great things you can do, Wayne was telling me that he used this for years. I think Piper has something similar. He had a group of people who committed to pray for youth. And they actually put their name on a list, and when a special need would come up, Wayne knew that he could call these people or email them, and they would pray for those kids. God may be calling you to that kind of a ministry, to commit yourself to pray for our youth, because I'll tell you what, there are a lot of giants out there. There's a lot of stuff our kids are up against, and they're going to have to face in the years ahead. And to join with them and to pray for them as they go through that. In fact, if you're willing to be one of those prayer partners, why don't you take your connection card this morning and just put on there, Piper, I'll pray. Put your name, your contact information down, and he'll make a list and he'll use you. Few things we can do would mean more than to lift our youth up and pray for them. There are giants around us. There are Davids among us. Let's pray that as a church, Dungeness Community Church, that we will continue to rise to the challenge to prepare them to rise to the challenge. Amen.